This is a study guide for Principles of Agroecology, the midterm exam, and I hope this will help you prepare. I think you recall at the beginning of our course, we do have a number of materials to prepare you for the material throughout the semester. We do have the garden case study and the farm case study, which you've already read in preparation for activities in class. So definitely be familiar with our SD garden and with our farm. The SD garden, for example, I would expect y'all to have an idea that the greenhouse is an active solar collector. It's not passive. So that's an example of the things that you need to know. I would say with the farm, some things are important to know that we normally have livestock, we're integrated farm. Again, have an idea about how the new greenhouse at the farm that's being built right now, the new greenhouse under construction actually stores heat from the sun in the soil. So these are examples of things that you need to know about SD facilities. When we started talking about sustainable food and ag systems, what I gave you, you of course read chapter 1, and I didn't do a mini lecture for this. This was actually a PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint made sure that you understand, reading in the chapter about really industrial style agriculture is to maximize profits and production, and that these are the key things that industrial ag are based on: the intensive tillage, synthetic fertilizers, irrigation. I think you'll recall how these form the backbone of very high yield agriculture. But there have been adverse impacts. So these were some of the things that we talked about, and you all said yourselves that you're concerned about many of these things. So review the PowerPoint and remember, how we talk about the problems with ecology, we talk about the problems with inequity also, and then we talk about ways to fix that, ways to reduce negative impact on the environment, and the things that need to be fostered. And this does take us to the ecosystem processes like effective solar capture, like nutrient cycling, like effective water use, and then depending on biological diversity for the interactions. So this helps us envision what sustainable ag and food systems are based on, and then how we move towards it. So use that PowerPoint and the chapter, of course, to help you prepare. Ag concerns I listed as a resource. These were things you were concerned about. But if things are listed as a resource, you don't really need to memorize anything from resources. It's a resource for you. All right, recall that once we started talking about the concepts of agroecology, we did have both the reading guide for the chapter 2, so you are responsible for the material in chapter 2, and then we had a mini lecture that helped you. It's almost like a reading guide in itself. It really helps you focus on the key factors. And you can use these reading guides to help you prepare for the midterm exam, because I am likely to ask, what is an agroecosystem? I may well ask about the organization, understanding the ecosystem structure. And we've been talking about in our class mainly at the organism level. We have started moving up to the population level with interactions. And by the end of the semester, we will be talking about organization on a community and ecosystem level. I think, we did talk about trophic structures, how different organisms feed, and that led us into looking at the energy pyramid, how energy moves throughout the ecosystem. You need to understand ecosystem functioning, and again, that's the key functions of energy flow, nutrient cycling, interactions, and then being able to apply these ecosystem concepts to agriculture, which are human-directed systems. So the reading in the chapter and also the mini lecture give you more details on that. The king corn, you read or watched that video, you need to be familiar with king corn. And then we moved into looking at the plant, and this really helped us look at photosynthesis. That was review for some of y'all, but this is what effective solar capture is, so that you need to understand the process of photosynthesis, either know the word formula, using carbon dioxide and water and light to give glucose and also produces oxygen, or you can use chemical formula. You do need to know about the different photosynthetic pathways in crop plants, and that most of the world's crops generally use the C3. Understand how photosynthesis is limited. Because of there's a lot of maintenance that the plant requires, and there's respiration that needs to take place, so there's a limit on how much solar energy a leaf can capture, and then there's a limit on how much is actually converted to biomass. Understand about carbon partitioning. Definitely know the plant nutrients, the macronutrients and the micronutrients, how water moves through the plant, and then understand a few crops. And I think in the mini lecture, I actually gave you a few crops to know specifically what families they're in. Of course, you're reading king corn, and you watched Kiss the Ground, so make sure you're familiar with Kiss the Ground. I added some resources, especially for people that are planting cool season crops right now, but these are resources. And then we move to soil. You can use the soil reading guide to remind you that, we talked about the textures of soil. We talked about clay being the smallest texture, and then silt and sand is actually the largest. We talked about the ideal soil, that it might surprise you that a lot of the ideal soil is actually pore space, about 50% pore space for air and water. We looked at how the soil structure differs from soil texture because it includes the aggregate forms, and the aggregates are created from organic matter. And that's something that we can definitely influence, and that's how we get good tilth. We talked about the cation exchange capacity, that's one of the ways that plants get the nutrients that they need through the soil solution, understanding in particular how clay and humus can hold the positively charged nutrient cations like potassium, like calcium. And then we talked later too about plants also get a lot of their nutrients, remember, through the mutualisms with soil microbes that, the bacteria, fungus can bring up the minerals from deep below. We talked about the importance of soil pH, where organic matter comes from, that it is previously living material, but once you start working with the microbes in the soil, that they can actually resynthesize, as the organic matter is broken down, they can resynthesize that into humus, which lasts for a long time in the soil and holds a lot of carbon dioxide. So holds a lot of the carbon in the soil. That's why it's so important to sequester carbon in the soil, and the biota, the soil microbes, are key for this. You do need to know some about tillage, and definitely gave y'all a PowerPoint on that. For soil, be sure to watch the mini lecture again. The mini lectures, keep in mind that you can review these with or without the comments. You don't have to listen to the comments again unless you have, can't remember some of it. So that's an advantage that you can use those how you want to. You had a pretty minimal reading on cover crops, but I gave y'all 2 more PowerPoints here, a cover crop PowerPoint and also a soil management PowerPoint. So be sure, you had, like I say, a kind of a light reading with the cover crops, but it was important to understand, what tillage is. And your soil chapter touches on this, but I think you really need to understand a lot more about plowing and disking, harrowing, and, actually what rototilling and the mechanism is for beating the soil. This is a pretty intensive tilling of the soil. So, we talked about, okay, that's what tillage is, that's what intensive tillage is, and the way you can reduce it is by, you can just till the tops of beds, ridge tillage, or don't till at all. Use a cultivation of the seed bed only, which is drilling in the seed. And that's what we actually saw with the cover crops and no-till. So we saw a pretty good example of that. Understand what, the purpose of tillage is. Understand that permanent agriculture, perennials, trees, pasture, that means you don't have to till. And so that means you can keep more of the carbon in the soil. So, we look at images like these that are with the soil covered instead of looking at bare soil. We talked about some of the tillage tools, and we did talk about, how to maintain organic matter in the soil. This was discussed pretty well in your chapter, the reading on soil, using crop residue, soil armor, using cover crops, animal manure, compost. These are ways to maintain or restore organic matter. Also having high diversity, and then of course reducing tillage. One question that we really tried to answer, since we've done some of this by hand, we did some of this in the garden by hand, realize it takes a lot of time. How can we mechanize ag sustainably? So these are the ways that we looked at. You could still use a tractor perhaps. You definitely need to look at renewable energy for the tractor, but don't compact your soil by putting the tractor in when it's wet. And then be careful about your driving patterns to reduce passages over the field. So these were things that we talked about. You had, just a short reading on cover crops. And this is when we learned more about using the rye cover crop. And we actually watched a video on using a rye cover crop, that when you put cover crops in, you need to know how to terminate them. And many of your cover crops you can terminate because they'll just die in the wintertime. They're cold sensitive. But the hardy ones in our area, hardy ones tend to be like rye, or wheat is hardy in this area, barley, but oats, that's going to die and make a nice straw. So, this gave you an idea of how to grow cover crops after your main crop. And then, they grow in the fall, and then they go dormant over the winter, and they either die or they pop back up. And then the no-till cover crops is one thing that allows you to plant right into the seed bed and not open the soil. So got more options here if you wanted to learn more about cover crops. And then we did have a reading called Water in the Soil. This was a chapter 9 reading, but I also did bring in some components of the humidity and rainfall chapter in the book. So as we started learning about water irrigation certification, there were, a few things that you needed to learn in addition, like the hydrological cycle, and you definitely needed to understand how water moves through the soil with infiltration, percolation. It's got to get into the soil, and then you want to keep it from evaporating from the soil. It should really be moving through the plant by the process of transpiration. That's how it moves back out to the atmosphere. Understanding a little bit about soil moisture, like the field capacity. And, we had a demonstration on this in the garden one day, that, just putting your sponge in the water and letting the gravitational water come out, that's field capacity. But then once we squeeze, the students squeeze the sponge, that's really what gave you the wilting point, because that's when the micropores were also emptied of water. So, you really want to maintain your soil at field capacity if you can. We talked about the problems with irrigation, that it does change a lot of the ecosystem. Plus, it's using up water that belongs to the future, without recharging it. So we looked at options for dryland farming, and there was page 75 from a different chapter that you were responsible for, and it's also covered in the mini lecture. That it's very interesting to look at how do we raise crops in areas that are actually arid or semi-arid, and it does mean farming in a way that stores the water in the soil, and you're not trying to collect rainfall and store it in a cistern because it would evaporate, but ways to store it in the soil and actually grow crops with stored water. So we looked at ways to make sure that water moves through crops instead of evaporating from the surface of the soil. And some crops actually use less water, like sorghum as an example, compared to corn. But having high organic matter in your soil, that will also help retain moisture. So these are some of the things that we looked at, and the mini lecture covers, so be sure to review that. We did talk also about weed management as part of our tillage discussion. We use the University of California as an example, that they use a stale weed bed that they actually encourage with water, and they encourage their weeds to grow, flush them out, and then they took care of their weeds with a pretty easy to use hula hoe on top of the bed, and then they used a tractor to take care of the weeds in the furrows and the sides of the bed. We also began to study biotic factors. So you had a reading guide and a mini lecture for this. So there were just many areas that y'all covered with your discussions, understanding what these interactions are, that they're often going to be a removal interaction, like herbivory is an example, competition is an example, or it's going to be an addition type interaction, like mutualisms. And actually it is the mutualisms and coexistence that's probably more important to evolution instead of competition. So plants, learning how to work together, basically. Some of the key mutualisms are, and understand how the soil microbes, the fungi, bring up minerals from the lower soil profiles, and they give that to the vascular plant, and the plant gives the fungi sugar. And very similar with the rhizobium bacteria, that the bacteria gives the plant nitrogen, if it's a nitrogen fixer, if it's a legume, and the plant gives sugar to the bacteria. Allelopathy is, this is nature's herbicides, these types of compounds, tannins, for example, phenolic acids. These are things that inhibit the growth of other plants around a plant. And, black walnut is one of the major plants, tree that we talk about that produces juglone is an example of an allelopathic compound. But there's many plants, cover crops like rye, that also secrete allelopathic compounds. The book didn't talk as much about nature's pesticides, but we talk about it in our mini lecture, because these are secondary plant compounds that help protect the plant, since the plant can't run away from herbivores. So it is going to be some things like ergot alkaloids, just some very interesting compounds that actually can reduce herbivory, so we can use them in organic agriculture. And some of these are quite specific to the target pest. So we do have ways to control pest that's not the type of scorched earth policy that kills all insects. There's other ways to do it. So those are some of the things we talked about with biotic factors, and that is, of course, organisms interacting with each other, living organisms. And if we have a lot of interactions, a lot of diversity, then that can help us control our pest and build resilience. So be sure to review the mini lecture. These were some resources for you, but keep in mind with the USDA National Organic Program, in our mini lecture, we did talk about a few specific things, what's permitted and what's not permitted. Keep in mind, usually natural things are permitted and synthetic things are not permitted in crop and livestock production, but there are some exceptions, so you need to be familiar with that. We studied genetics, and so you had a reading guide, and you also had a mini lecture on genetics. And we discussed how the environment determines what traits are advantageous in natural selection. But once we started directing selection as humans in agriculture, we really changed things, and we domesticated plants. And we domesticated them in all about the same time, 10,000 years ago, in 6 different areas. I think it's important to know what's from the Americas. Know that chili peppers, not just the Three Sisters, chili peppers are from the Americas, chocolate, there's some wonderful crops used all over the world. Understand that the carbon partitioning differs in domesticated crops compared to the wild species, because so much of the carbon it's been selected, to go to the harvestable biomass and instead of the root. And so this is one of the reasons that domestic plants are dependent on us. Understanding different methods of reproduction in plants. And this was really reinforced for us at the farm, when Chip talked about plants that are self-pollinated, plants that are cross-pollinated, and the impact on seed saving. Be familiar with the types of directed selection, the mass selection that has been practiced for most of the 10,000 years we've been doing agriculture, that the crops and animals are still tied to the land, and they still have to have some vigor to survive. It's only been recently, in the past few decades, that we've been able to make hybrid plants and really control the pollination. So a hybrid plant is not open pollinated. It's a controlled type pollination. And that's why Chip really recommended for y'all, don't raise hybrids. Use plants that are open pollinated, because those are the ones that we can actually do seed saving. Definitely understand the difference between hybrid and GMO. GMO has only been possible since the 90s. And that's when we, tinker with the genome. And that's inserting genes from actually one species into another species and asking, do we really want to do that? Although we have identified, yes, some GMO are resistant to drought, and there could be other advantages, but do we really know more than nature? You need to know which foods are GMO in the U.S. marketplace, and there is a list in your mini lecture, and I also did refer y'all to the Non-GMO Project. Most animals in the marketplace, animal products, are not actually GMO. I think the Non-GMO Project warns you against it because they're fed GMO feeds, but the animals themselves are not, just like us. We eat GMOs, but we're not actually genetically modified. Understand the consequence of loss of genetic diversity in agriculture. why it's so important that we have diverse ag, how it gives us resilience, and then how to preserve biodiversity in ag. And Chip at the farm gave you an excellent example of seed saving. And also livestock need to be conserved, our endangered breeds. So anytime that we have animals that are all the same genetics or plants that are all the same genetics, they're so vulnerable to disease. And, to me, it really plays into talking about, what causes our pandemic too. So be sure to review that mini lecture, review the SD Farm case study. Here's the non-GMO project. It's listed as a resource, but you do need to know which crops are commonly genetically modified. And then over the weekend, you do have a reading now on climate and ag. And this reading will help you understand the main gases that are involved in emissions with agriculture, that it's not just carbon dioxide, it's also the methane that we need to be careful about, and also the nitrous oxide. So be sure to watch this mini lecture. Good luck studying, and let me know if you have questions.